Good morning, everyone. Hello, may I have your attention, please? Good morning. Sorry for interrupting your breakfast, but good morning and welcome. I think it's time to start the event. A lot of people have been asking me, why is the Indian Chamber organizing an event on Brexit? And I think that's a fair question, so I thought I might as well address the elephant in the room. So first and foremost, one of the largest Indian conglomerates, which is also a member of the Indian Chamber of Commerce, has been adversely affected by Brexit. The planned divestiture of the Tata Group's UK steel plants have been put on hold, and it is in jeopardy. And I'm not sure how many of you know that the Tata Group, which is actually an Indian group, is one of the largest private employers in Britain. On the other hand, the Mahindra Group is expecting the business with Britain to increase due to Brexit. Now, what gives? Two major Indian conglomerates and two diametrically opposite views. Closer home in Korea, SsangYong Motors, which is also a charter member of the Indian Chamber of Commerce, has been adversely affected as their exports to Britain has become less profitable. Second, ICCK is anchored on a number of value principles, and one of them is global citizenship. It means that ICCK will demonstrate our curiosity and concern with action on substantive issues impacting the world. And surely Brexit is one of them. On a global scale, most of us here have witnessed a number of economic and political shocks over the last 30 or 40 years. We have seen the collapse of the Soviet Union and communism. We have also seen the emergence of China and India as market economies. And at this very moment, we are on the cusp of yet another major transformation on the global economic order. The question is, are we witnessing the beginning of the end of the European Union as we know it? Now, fortunately, I don't have to answer these questions. I just have to raise them. So we have with us some eminent speakers who have come here to share with us their deep insight on Brexit. It is now my privilege to invite our opening speaker to address you. Ms. Sue Kinoshita, the Minister, Counselor, Deputy Head of Mission and Director of UK Trade and Investment at the British Embassy here in Korea, will address you now. Amongst her many diverse and fascinating assignments, the one that caught my attention was her work on EU accession issues. Now, what an interesting coincidence that is. So, with no further delay, let me introduce to you Ms. Sue Kinoshita. Thank you, Ms. Sue.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and good morning to you all, and thank you for the invitation to speak at your event this morning. I must apologize first of all that the ambassador isn't speaking. I'm afraid he had a prior engagement, so you've got the B team, but I hope you'll find what I have to say interesting nonetheless. And congratulations to the Indian Chamber of Commerce in Korea for being the first chamber to take up this Brexit challenge and try to explain it to its members. I think you've beaten the British Chamber to it, at least. And from the number of people here in the room, you can tell that you've really tapped into a topic that is of deep interest to very many people. So congratulations for recognizing that. And I think you're right in what you said at the end about this being a bit of a pivotal moment, a historic moment. A lot of things get described as historic, and certainly over the last couple of weeks as the Olympics have been going on, we've heard about lots of historic achievements. A British trampolinist who won a bronze medal, that was described as a historic moment. Well, maybe it was for that person, maybe it was for the history of British trampolining, But I think in 50 years' time, how many people will remember that? Whereas Brexit, I think, does truly qualify as a historic event that will have very far-reaching repercussions, not just in the UK, not just in Europe, but in India, Korea, and all over the world. I wanted to set some of the context for the rather more expert speakers who will be coming later, particularly the political context for Brexit. And I wanted to start by saying a few words about the reasons for the decision that was made by the British people in the referendum exactly 2 months ago. And I think it's worth looking at that because there are lessons there for other countries as well, including for Korea and I'm sure also for India. And that is that this probably the single biggest driver for the referendum debate and for the votes to leave the EU was a sense of being left behind by globalization. The areas that voted most strongly for leaving the EU were the poorest areas of the UK. They were also, ironically, the areas that received most in EU funding and had the lowest levels of immigration. So the idea that this was a vote against the EU, against immigration, doesn't always bear up in reality. These were people who saw their income stagnating, they were feeling the effects of many years of government austerity, there was a lack of job security for young and unskilled workers, and it was all of those things that were happening to them despite the UK as a whole having a pretty healthy economy that was leading them to feel that there was something not quite right. And they saw the referendum as an opportunity for a protest vote, if you like. So I think there is a lesson there for other countries, and that is to try to ensure that growth is as inclusive as possible, and the importance also of keeping in touch with the regions, because it was, I think, abundantly clear that the metropolitan elite in London was not aware of what was happening outside London and hadn't realised the strength of feeling in other parts of the UK. But there were also people who voted for Brexit for rather more positive reasons. They were looking for greater sovereignty, for greater autonomy in decision-making, for the power to decide their own regulations rather than adopting EU regulations, the autonomy in deciding how to spend their money, the chance to project our own unique British values and priorities. And I think it's quite interesting that although the initial reaction in much of the UK on the 24th of June was one of horror, my goodness, what have we done? There is now, even amongst those who initially voted to remain, a sense of, actually maybe there are some opportunities here. Maybe we can use this as an opportunity to acquire more autonomy and to acquire a clearer voice on the international stage. I think one thing that has characterized the reaction to the referendum result is concern that the UK is going to become distracted at best from rather bigger international issues and at worst isolationist. And I'd like just to address those two things. Distracted, well, yes, maybe, because this is a big, big task. There are very many things to tackle. But one thing that gives, I think, a little bit of reassurance, I hope, to other governments is that the new Prime Minister has set up 2 new departments to lead on the whole process of negotiating our exit from the EU and our new relationships with other countries. So we now have a department for exiting the EU, DEXU, which is a word I'm still trying to get used to. And also a department for international trade, which will be responsible for negotiating new trade agreements with our international partners. That means that the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which is my home department, is freed up to concentrate on all the other issues that are happening around the world where the UK still very much wants to have a voice. So we may, there may be a little bit of distraction, certainly, while we work our way through this process, but that doesn't mean that we are turning our backs on the world. And I wanted to illustrate that by just telling you a few of the things that have happened in British international policy just in the past 8 weeks since the referendum took place. So we have announced £60 million worth of new funding to support Iraq. We've agreed to reinforce our presence in Afghanistan. We've renewed our commitment to our nuclear deterrent, including the construction of 4 ballistic missile submarines. We've made new commitments of troops to Estonia and to Poland at the NATO summit in Warsaw in July. We've committed to continue our participation in the NATO naval operation that is working to reduce migration across the Mediterranean. And our Secretary of State for International Development has announced a new £100 million package for education and other initiatives to support disadvantaged girls around the world. That's just in a few weeks, and that's when most politicians have been away on holiday, actually. So to me, that is not a sign of a country that is so devoured by problem solving on Brexit that it can't possibly think about anything else, nor is it a sign of a country that intends to retire into its own shell. We are very proud that the UK is going to be the first country simultaneously to meet the NATO target of spending 2% of our GDP on defence and the UN target of spending 0.7% of our GNI on development. And remember that the UK is still, I think, just about the 5th biggest economy in the world. It depends a little bit from day to day whether France or the UK is the 5th and the 6th. But we're the 5th biggest economy in the world. And so those are big sums of money. 2%, 0.7% may not sound very much, but those are significant sums of money that we want to use to make sure that we are a force for good in the world. We intend also to remain a strong partner for India and for Korea via the United Nations. We are, of course, a member of the Permanent Five, and we have, interestingly, a voting record that is more closely aligned with Korea than with any other country, any other 2 countries actually in the United Nations. Only UK and Korea have the closest voting record. So I think we will remain very close partners there. We'll be partners for both of you in the G20, and we're looking forward to the meetings in China next month. We will remain key members of the OECD and of NATO, and I know that both India and Korea have strong partnerships with those. We'll remain, of course, key members of the Commonwealth, a very important forum for our discussing issues with India and our other Commonwealth partners. And we will retain our position in the G7, in this part of the world, in the 5-Power Defence Agreement, part of the Five Eyes, the UN Command here in Korea, any number of organisations where we will still be using our influence. You're still going to be seeing a lot of the UK at international meetings around the world. We're not going to be withdrawing. So I hope that gives some reassurance. And I hope also that you can see that Brexit is not just a risk. It does also offer opportunities. It will give us greater flexibility to prioritise as we see fit. Perhaps more freedom to create or to join other regional groupings, more resource to put into growing markets like Korea, like India. We've just last month announced the opening of 3 new trade offices in the United States. So again, an indication of the fact that we feel that there are opportunities for the UK outside the EU, and we intend to take advantage of those. We'll have more flexibility in framing our immigration policy. So any number of areas where leaving the EU will give us a little bit more headspace, a little bit more flexibility to do things as we see fit. It will also give us greater agility in responding to events. Here in Korea, obviously one of the big issues is the sanctions policy that we exercise currently against DPRK. At the moment, we align ourselves with the EU sanctions policy. In future, we will have the opportunity to develop our own sanctions policy and maybe be a little more agile in responding to provocations. More agility in responding to international disasters and so on. A lot of our aid at the moment is channeled via the EU. In future, we will have more autonomy about how we spend that. So greater flexibility, greater agility, and also I think we can become an additional voice on the world stage. Very often, that voice will be completely aligned with the voice of the EU, but sometimes it may be a little different, and at least it is an additional voice that will complement and supplement the EU's. So I'm sure you're expecting me to try to be reassuring today, and you may remain sceptical about some of that, and I'm sure our later speakers will give perhaps a more objective view. But from a British government point of view, I really want to reassure you that the UK is here to stay, and that there are some positives to be taken from our divorce, as we're hearing later, our divorce from the EU. There are many, many issues to work through. I wouldn't want to understate the complexity or the difficulty of those. There is, first of all, our relationship with the EU. What form will that take? We need to disentangle so much of our domestic legislation from EU requirements. We need to think about how to protect the interests of Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales, who very largely voted to remain in the EU. That is crucial if we're going to preserve the union of the United Kingdom. We need to think about the position of our overseas territories, particularly Gibraltar, which of course is very much caught there between UK and Spain and very concerned about its future, but also some of our other overseas territories which benefit from large amounts of EU development funding. We need to think about our immigration regime, both for EU nationals and for non-EU nationals. How is that going to look? What's the trade-off going to be between freedom of movement and access to EU markets? Many, many issues. So it's you cannot underplay the significance of those. But our commitment is strong to remaining a principled, an active and outward-looking player on the world stage. Our new Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, has said that he wants the Foreign Office, the diplomatic service, to be more energetic than ever in representing the UK. So if you see us not being energetic, please tell us, because we need to make sure that our impact is still being felt. I think most of you here are working in business, and therefore, although political stability is important, what you really care about is the economy and about trade. So I would like to move on to that next. I'm very conscious that businesses around the world are very worried about the impact that Brexit might have on the global economy and on their own businesses, and we've already heard a couple of examples of companies who've both benefited and potentially lost from Brexit. It's gratifying that stock markets now have stabilised. Certainly there was a lot of very short-term shock in the immediate aftermath of the referendum. That seems now to have stabilised. But of course the uncertainty is going to now be quite prolonged for quite some time, at least 2.5, 3 years, and possibly longer. So I think we're all expecting that there will be further wobbles. There's nothing that business likes worse than uncertainty. But from the point of view of the UK and what we can do to try to minimise those shocks and wobbles, our economic fundamentals are extremely strong. We have low inflation, we have very low unemployment. In fact, we have the highest employment rates and vacancies rates since records began, pretty much. We have a much reduced budget, down to just 3%, budget deficit, sorry, down to just 3%, and we have very strong reserves, capital reserves. Capital requirements for banks now are 10 times higher than they were before the crisis in 2008. So the fundamentals are strong. And in recognition of that, I think, the investments are still pouring into the UK. We saw Wells Fargo set up a new European headquarters in the UK in early July. We've seen SoftBank purchasing Arm. UK's own GSK, major pharmaceuticals company, has invested £250 million in new manufacturing capability in the UK. Just last week, Samsung C&T, I'm delighted to say, invested £176 million in a new biomass plant in Teesside in the northeast of England. And Dong Energy, the Danish wind power farm, investing $6 billion in the largest offshore wind farm anywhere in the world. And also in July, the London Stock Exchange issued the very first rupee-denominated bond. I think those are all signs that business confidence in the UK is remaining pretty strong, and that in turn is having a stabilising effect. The Bank of England and the Treasury have also been doing their bit to try to reassure markets and investors. So the Governor of the Bank of England has recently reduced interest rates and stepped up quantitative easing. And just last weekend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Hammond, gave reassurances that the British government would pick up the funding for multi-year EU projects that were agreed now, even after we've left the EU, whether those are infrastructure projects, research and development initiatives, agricultural funding. So that's brought a little bit of reassurance and stability. We hope in time that sterling will start to recover its value and relieve the pressure on exporters and on safe haven currencies. For the moment, the sterling is still pretty low, and I'm sure our economic experts later will talk a little bit more about that and its impacts, but it has stabilized. I think the most obvious issue, certainly for Korea, and I guess also for India, although I'm not quite as close to that relationship, is free trade agreements. Where do those go? The EU-Korea free trade agreement has demonstrably benefited both the EU and Korea, and it's certainly benefited the UK. The UK is Korea's largest goods exports market in the EU, and Korea is the third largest market in Asia for UK goods after China and Hong Kong. So larger than Japan and larger than Australia. And I think that's largely down to the impact of the free trade agreement. So there's strong motivation, I think, on both sides to ensure a seamless transition to enable our companies to continue to trade with one another. It's true that we have limited resources right now for trade negotiation. The British government has relied very much on the EU for negotiating its trade deals over the past 30, 40 years. And so we're a bit short of people who know what to do. And maybe we should hire a few people from Korea. I think you've got more expertise perhaps than anybody. And that means that we are going to have to prioritize the order and the speed with which we conclude new free trade agreements with countries outside the EU. We were really delighted that Korea put its hand up so early on, saying that they wanted to conclude a bilateral trade agreement. We are hoping that our Minister for International Trade will be visiting Korea soon to start to understand what Korea would be looking for from a renegotiated bilateral agreement, and to try to map out how that might be taken forward. But there are other countries too, including India, who are very keen to establish bilateral free trade agreements, and we are going to have to prioritize. We are doing the analysis at the moment, and the Prime Minister ultimately will decide which ones to take forward first, balancing, of course, against the most important thing, which is defining our new arrangements with the EU markets themselves. And I think before she can decide that, she needs to decide on her basic approach to trade and to our relationship with the EU. I fully expect one of the first questions at the end of this to be, so what's the timing? When are you going to trigger Article 50? That's the starting gun which will get everything underway. There is no clear answer to that yet. What the Prime Minister has made clear is that she wants to be sure before she starts negotiations where she's going, what her strategy is, what she wants the end point to be, and I think anybody would respect the wisdom of that position. It's only the UK that can trigger Article 50. There will be pressures from both people within the UK who voted for leaving and want that to happen quickly, and from our EU partners and probably international partners too, who want to minimize the period of uncertainty. But I think it is very important that we know where we're going before we embark on the journey of disentangling ourselves. And then I think finally I just wanted to say a little bit about what the EU might look like minus the UK. There have been a lot of concerns expressed about a possible domino effect. I have to say I think it would be a brave leader right now who would take their country into leaving the EU, having realised the enormity of what exit means in practice. But it's true that many EU member states face similar pressures to those that were driving the agenda in the UK, disaffected groups, the rise of nationalist groups. So there will be pressures, I'm sure, in other countries, and a lot of people watching very carefully to see how the UK's exit from the EU progresses. And that could have an impact on the way in which the negotiations play out. There will be quite a lot of incentive for some to make life as difficult as possible for the UK in order to discourage their own people from even considering voting for an exit of their own. But I think it's worth noting that all the EU member states, with the exception of Ireland, actually have a trade surplus with the UK. They're not going to want to jeopardise that. They nearly all have very substantial investments in the UK. They all have interdependent supply chains. You look at companies like Airbus, who manufacture in France but bring their wings in from the UK. They all have substantial populations living in the UK. They have many educational exchanges. They have many research collaborations. There are many, many stakeholders in all the EU member states who will want to limit the damage from the UK's departure. So that, in turn, will act as a moderating influence, I think, on their governments as they form their stance to the negotiations. Regardless of that, I think both India and Korea will want to consider how to preserve your influence within the EU once you've lost what I hope you'd agree has been the very helpful advocacy of the UK. Because the UK has been influential in shaping EU policy in areas that matter to both India and to Korea. Free trade, human rights, climate change, development, rules-based international system. These are all areas of importance for both India and Korea, where the UK has played a leading role in defining EU policy. You'll have a sense of which other member states align with your interests and are likely to be like-minded on these issues, but I think you are going to be wanting to intensify your links with the EU, because the EU is going to remain an influential player, and I wouldn't like to think that you had to feel you had to make a choice between the two. Both will be important. Links with both will be important. And I also hope that in time you'll find that having an additional globally engaged, principled and proactive friend in Western Europe working alongside the EU will benefit you and will benefit your interests. And certainly it is our intention as the British government to maintain the strongest possible relationship with Korea and with India as we go through the process of exiting the EU. I'm going to end my remarks there. I expect there will be more questions later, probably more questions than I can possibly have answers for at this stage. But thank you for inviting me to speak at your event, and I look forward to hearing what our other speakers have to say. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am pleasantly surprised to see so many people early this morning. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming to the Indian Chamber of Commerce in Korea Brexit seminar this morning. My name is Jongnam Oh, or simply Oh, Senior Advisor at Kim Hyun-jang. And graduating from the College of Law, Seoul National University in 1975, I joined the Korean government and worked at today's Ministry of Strategy and Finance for 30+ years. As an economic bureaucrat. During the Asian financial crisis, I was economic secretary to President Kim Dae-jung and moved to the IMF Retiring from the IMF in 2006, I joined Kim and Jang as a senior advisor and economist. Right after the UK Brexit referendum, Kim and Jang was planning a Brexit breakfast seminar like this to discuss the impact of the Brexit on the global economy and the implications for Korea. The seminar was held on August 4th for exclusively Kim and Jang's important clients, mainly country representatives of multinational corporations doing business in Korea. To our seminar that I moderated, I invited Mr. Dilip Sundaram, the chairman of the Indian Chamber of Commerce in Korea. And Mr. Sundaram invited me to moderate today's seminar. That's why I am here today. I'm honored and happy today to play the role as a moderator of the Brexit seminar for the second time. As soon as I got up this morning, I checked the home pages of the IMF and the World Bank. Surprisingly, I have not found any speeches or announcements by those two institutions since July 19th. What does that mean? They need to see more progress to make any more comments or announcements since they announced the World Economic Outlook on July 19th. On that day, the IMF Economic Counselor, Mr. Maurice Ostfeld, had a press conference on the release of the July 2016 World Economic Outlook, WEO. In his introductory remarks at the press conference, he said the following, quote, "The United Kingdom's June 23rd vote to leave the European Union as downward pressure to a world economy at a time when growth has been slower amid an array of pre-existing risks. Thanks to some promising signs in the first half of 2016, such as stronger than expected growth in the Eurozone and Japan, some recovery of commodity prices, the IMF was, as of June 22nd, prepared to upgrade its 2016 and 17 growth projections slightly. But Brexit has thrown a spanner in the works, and the new WEO update downgrades those numbers. It is important, therefore, to underscore that the real effects of Brexit will play out gradually over time, perhaps over many months, adding elements of economic and political uncertainty that will have to be resolved over a long period. There is also uncertainty about the length and contentiousness of the negotiations, of market difficulty engaging how the resulting uncertainty will depress demand, specifically investment, consumer durables, and hiring, unquote. To simply put, the Brexit has brought at least 2 years of uncertainty in the global economy from many perspectives. I'd like to thank Ms. Kinoshita of the British Embassy to deliver us an opening remarks before we discuss with distinguished speakers. So now is the time to introduce our distinguished speakers. First, Mr. David Fallon, and Dr. Jun Park, and Dr. Hung Jong Kim. We have 3 speakers in a row. Mr. David Fallon is a director of Deloitte Hong Kong, in charge of UK desk. He is a tax expert, so very, very relevant speaker, first speaker this morning. Next, Dr. Jong Park. He is head of research at the Standard Chartered Bank, Korea. And lastly, Dr. Hung Jong Kim, Senior Research Fellow of Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, Kiev. He is currently advising the Korean authorities on many FTA issues. Mr. David Fallon is going to talk about what do we know and what can we expect. That's the topic. And Mr. Jong Park, it's not familiar, but after the divorce. Finally, Dr. Hung Jong Kim, Korea EU, Korea UK, FTAs after the Brexit. Those are the topics discussed by each speaker. And today's seminar will be convened as follows. Each speaker will address us for about 20 minutes. 20 minutes. And after the presentation, I would like to open the floor, and I will ask the speakers to entertain the audience through Q&A. That's the order. Mr. Fallon, you have the floor.
Good morning, everyone. Great pleasure to be here today to give a UK perspective on Brexit and what we know and what we can potentially expect. Brexit is obviously all prevalent in the news at the moment, and I was struck just yesterday when I was thinking about Great Britain's performance in the Olympics and our record medal tally. And noting that we finished second in the world. Fantastic, I thought. And then one of my European colleagues sent me this and noted that the European Union would be on top. But in seriousness, what do we know and what can we expect? So what we know is obviously on the 23rd of June, 2 months ago, 51.9% of voters elected to leave the European Union. We now have a new Prime Minister, Theresa May, who herself was a Remain campaigner. But she's been very clear that Brexit means Brexit. So something's going to happen. The challenge is we don't really know what that means yet. But she's appointed 3 prominent Brexit MPs to her cabinet in terms of the Foreign Office, the new department for exiting the EU, and the international trade. So we know there is going to be very much a direction of travel out of the EU. Our new Chancellor has said there will not be an emergency budget, but his focus is changing to be more on economic growth rather than deficit reduction. And in terms of the economic picture, what we're seeing is that there's been a sharp fall in both consumer and business confidence post the vote. Although the economic picture is still a little bit mixed, we are seeing, for example, retail sales in the UK remaining strong, and we had good numbers for July. But generally, the consensus across economists is that UK growth will fall to about 0.4% against a pre-referendum forecast of 2.1%. So what don't we know? Well, we don't really know yet how the government will react. We don't know when, and we put up there if, Article 50 will be triggered. And obviously Article 50, that trigger point, is critical because that starts a 2-year negotiation period with the EU about how we legally leave. Probably on timing, best estimates are sometime early next year, to recent commentary saying it may be delayed until later next year. We don't know what our stance on immigration is at the moment. And there's always a potential for a general election in the UK, earlier than the planned 2020 election. For example, if the government decided it wanted to seek a further mandate from the people about its approach to negotiate with the EU. Probably most importantly, we don't really know yet how our EU partners are going to react in the negotiation, and we're having kind of mixed views, with the Belgian Prime Minister saying the EU will not accept having to pay the bill for the UK's decision to leave the EU, but a more conciliatory tone from the Germans. So what this all means is we don't know how long negotiations will take and how they will conclude. So in terms of time frame, as I say, the key thing is that trigger point, Article 50. And then at the end of that period, either we will have negotiated our position with our EU partners, or potentially we could extend the 2-year period for negotiation, but that will require the unanimous consent of the 27 EU partners. So in all likelihood, at the end of that 2 years, we could be faced with a position where the UK has not completed its negotiation with the EU, and we fall outside the EU and potentially revert to some sort of World Trade Organization model. Now, in the interim, there's going to be potential for lots of change. We've got up there a point about potentially a second referendum. I mean, I think that's probably unlikely. There may be a general election, as I mentioned. But across Europe, there will be change, and we'll have some significant elections next year, which will colour negotiations. So what this all means is that there will be uncertainties about our future trading relationship with both the EU and the world, uncertainties about our UK law and how we integrate that post our exit from Europe, uncertainties around immigration and how we will manage that and the free movement of people. And this uncertainty will lead to volatility. We've already seen some volatility in capital and currency markets, and we expect potentially to be further declines in confidence. But there will be some opportunity as well, and certainly from an M&A perspective, there will be opportunities for foreign buyers to purchase UK assets with a depreciated sterling, and also potentially for sellers. Now, we've looked at all the various sectors across the economy, and we've assessed what we think the impact of Brexit could be across those sectors. And we've looked at it across currency movements, consumer confidence, business confidence, EU exit impacts, which includes tax and regulatory impacts, and the impact on workforce. And from that, we've concluded that there are 6 sectors, those highlighted in red in the attach, which are likely to be most affected. So, for example, if you look at our retail sector, we expect it to be highly impacted by consumer confidence, impacted on the cost of inputs from the fall in sterling, and a potential significant impact in relation to workforce, given that our retail workforce is made up of about 15% non-UK nationals, and 6% of those are from the EU. And of course, the all-important financial services sector is critical that we understand what's going to happen there, most likely impacted from regulatory issues, and whether post-EU we can still access the EU market through some sort of passporting rights. So in terms of the economy, we expect a decline in GDP growth, and this we expect to potentially be a short shock. As uncertainties begin to diminish, we expect confidence to return and for GDP growth to pick up. And obviously the long-term GDP growth position will be dependent on what type of relationship we can negotiate with the EU and with the rest of the world. And so in terms of possible trading models, I'll talk about those in a second, but a couple of observations. One, as Sue mentioned, the task in front of the UK is vast. We currently benefit from bilateral trade agreements through our membership of the EU with 53 other countries around the world. So, as Sue said, we'll have to prioritise our activities there. We'll also need to negotiate our membership of the WTO. At the moment, we are a member of the WTO through our membership of the EU, and that's another important area that we'll have to focus on. In terms of EU models, I'm sure many of you are familiar with these that have been put forward. The most commonly put forward are potentially an EEA model, a European Economic Area model, the Norwegian model. This would probably be the most attractive to business. It remains, it provides access to the single market in most areas. But what comes with this is probably unacceptable to the UK, and certainly those that voted for Brexit, which means the free movement of people and also paying our obligations to the EU budget. We also don't get a vote at the table in terms of EU legislation. So in some ways, and certainly from a Brexit perspective, this is potentially the worst of all worlds. And then there are some hybrid models in between, potentially a Swiss model, European Free Trade Agreement. It will provide less access to the single market. A big question again about whether we can build something that would give our financial services access to the EU. The Canadian model is often cited as a possible option. It's currently taken 7 years to, I think, get to the position where we are today, and it's still not ratified. So any negotiation around an advanced free trade agreement is likely to take a number of years. And then the default position, which is some sort of WTO model and no preferential access to the single market. So in terms of outcomes, in terms of probability, we've assessed what we think the position might be. So we consider that there is potentially still a slight possibility we could remain in the EU. But this would realistically only happen if there were probably a major, concessions given to the UK in the negotiation around free movement of people in particular. Or potentially, the economic impact is so great in the UK that it forces our politicians to go back to the people and reconsider the position. The more likely position is that we will leave the EU, a 90% chance of that happening. And then it could take one of two routes depending on what happens around immigration. So if we accept the free movement of EU nationals, which we think is quite a low probability, then we're likely to have access to the EEA Norwegian model or the Swiss free trade agreement type model. If we take back control of our borders completely, then we are likely to end up with a position such as the Canadian model or the WTO model. And so, we don't know what the answer is going to be at this point in time. If you were looking to try and assess what it means for your business, one option would be to consider the impact of reverting to a WTO model for a period of time, followed by maybe a more favorable FTA position. And I've seen some commentators talking about maybe we can negotiate a soft Brexit whereby we maintain some sort of access to the single market in the interim while we negotiate a full free trade agreement. So, in terms of the UK, it is and has been for a number of years a top European location for foreign direct investment, and there's a number of reasons for that. Depending as you count the numbers, either fifth or sixth largest trading nation in the world. It's a very easy place to do business. Geographically, that's not going to change. We're in the sort of center of Europe in a way. We cross Asia and US time zones. It's a very easy place to start up a new business. We have a very well-established legal system and a highly skilled workforce with excellent education systems and universities. And of course, we have a very competitive tax regime, again, something which will not go away as a result of Brexit. And then the other aspect is we have talked about the UK as being a gateway to Europe, and I think there's a big question there about whether that will remain or how it will remain in the future world. So we believe that Brexit will have an impact across a number of dimensions for businesses, in particular labour and talent issues. So potential restrictions on the free movement of people in the UK is likely to make it more challenging to attract and retain talent. I've talked about the market outlook and the uncertainties potentially there. In terms of trade, whether we have a negotiation that allows us free access to the European Union, or whether there will be a cost to businesses in terms of moving goods through the UK and cross borders with the EU. And then I think there are some questions around funding, although I think, Sue, you dealt with those around the Chancellor's recent comments. And there are lots of other areas. It's going to cross every part of business: foreign exchange, issues around data transfer, and of course tax. So let's talk about tax for a second. The UK has a very attractive corporate tax regime for multinational businesses. The current UK corporate tax rate is at 20%. It's going to reduce next year to 19%. And by 2020, it's due to drop further to 17%. Now, immediately post-Brexit, our previous Chancellor mentioned that the UK might take additional steps and actually reduce the UK corporate tax rate to 15%, but we'll have to wait and see whether that actually transpires. What we probably certainly don't want to do is antagonize our European partners. In terms of being a kind of a gateway to Europe and a holding company location, the UK is very attractive and will remain very attractive. So for a UK company holding investments in Europe and the rest of the world, dividends are usually tax exempt in the UK. We have no withholding taxes on dividends paid out of the UK. Capital gains on the disposal of shares are usually tax-free. We have great incentives for IP and R&D activity, and we've got a fantastic double tax treaty network. So that's all very powerful reasons why the UK should still be at the very forefront of anyone's mind if they're investing into Europe. There are also indirect tax implications, and today obviously we have a customs union with the single market. And we've got effectively a European tax system on VAT, which helps with consistency and companies' obligations on the indirect tax side. But it is on the indirect tax side where changes are most likely to be felt. So to take, for example, customs duty, this is almost entirely governed by EU law. 75% of customs duty collected by the UK is currently paid directly to the EU. Now, if we leave a customs union as a result of our negotiations, the UK will need to introduce its own domestic law. That may mean that goods become imports and exports through the UK. This could lead to potentially new tariffs. It will require companies to think about how they implement new systems, ERP systems, and so there will be an impact there. You'll need to think about it in connection with supply chain and how the movement of goods will be affected and whether additional administration will make that a challenge for your businesses. On the VAT side, our UK law is fully harmonised with the EU. The VAT really is a European tax. Now, it's fully integrated into our UK law. If we leave the EU, we'll still have VAT. It's a very important revenue raiser for the UK exchequer. About 17% of the UK's tax revenues are raised from VAT, and so we don't expect any reason that the UK government would get rid of VAT. But what they will have is potentially more scope to reduce rates or change what goods and services VAT is charged on. Now, from a direct tax perspective, probably less likely to be impacted. It's very much a national tax, and I wouldn't expect the architecture of the UK corporate tax system to change significantly. But what we do have is we have a number of directives, EU directives, that have been embedded into UK tax law over the years, and these are very much to aid intra-EU trade and investment. So reduce withholding tax on dividends, for example, between companies in the EU, reduce withholding tax on interest and royalties, potentially deferrals of capital gains on certain restructurings between EU companies. Now, all of these things could fall away if we leave the EU. There are also a number of kind of mutual assistance and partnering on international tax affairs that the UK is involved with, both at an EU level and an international level. And I wouldn't expect this to change. I think we'll be partners going forward in this area. Now, in terms of potentially impacts to your legal structures, what this slide illustrates is that the UK has a very broad double tax treaty network. We have over 120 double tax treaties with countries across the world. And for those that are marked in green on the attached, such as France, Spain, and Sweden, post-EU, even when the EU parent subsidiary directive falls away and the interest and royalties directives fall away, the withholding tax position on those flows should remain the same. We have double tax treaties which still allow for 0% withholding. But certain other countries may be impacted, and I've highlighted in blue Germany, for example, Austria, where there may be some leakage, Germany in particular, on dividends. And those in red may indicate where there's bigger issues. So groups should be looking at their legal structures, looking at where the UK is involved in that legal structure, and considering kind of the flows of capital around that structure to see whether or not post-Brexit there would be any inefficiency. And to give an example of that, in this example here, if you had a UK company holding a German subsidiary, at the moment, dividends paid up from Germany to the UK would be 0%. Post-Brexit, if we leave the EU, there would be a withholding tax at 5% on those dividends. So a group might want to consider restructuring. It may want to consider moving that subsidiary out of the UK and potentially to another European holding company, where they could benefit from a 0% withholding rate. But there might be other options. From a Korean perspective, it may be actually beneficial just to move the German subsidiary under Korea. Now, a number of groups I'm aware of are looking at their structures and trying to consider whether we should be making some changes. But in reality, it's too early, I think, to be making wholesale changes. But what groups should be doing is assessing the position and monitoring the changes. A quick word on employer matters. So I think employee communication is critical at this time, and to have a strategy to manage employee uncertainty. As I said, we don't know what our stance on immigration at the moment will be and what the new picture will look like. We don't know, for example, what will be the status of EEA nationals that currently work in the UK and have been working there pre-Brexit. And what about those that want to move to the UK now, post-Brexit? Will their position be different? Hopefully we'll get some clarity on that quickly. From a mobile employee perspective, another thing businesses need to be aware of is obviously with the currency fluctuations, that will have an impact on remuneration of your employees. You'll need a consistent strategy to manage and kind of deal with that and think about how you compensate people for potentially disadvantaged positions as a result of Brexit. And then finally, tax and social security. Again, one to watch for. At this stage, it's unclear what the impact will be. It all depends on how our new relationship with the EU will look. But ultimately, it may result in extra layers of pension and healthcare protection required if we leave the EU completely. And so, in conclusion, what is the Brexit impact? Risk, we know about that. Short-term shock. Medium-term, hopefully some more certainty before we get a long-term picture of where the UK will be going with Europe and the rest of the world. People impact changes. What does that mean for your business? You should be assessing it. The commercial picture. Are you going to be impacted by regulatory matters? Will you have access to the EU markets post the EU? And then the tax costs. Look at the supply chain. Maybe model out a WTO type model. Think about the implications for your IT and ERP systems. Look at that direct tax legal structure and consider whether there's any implications for your businesses. I've talked about maybe looking at corporate reorganizations and moving European headquarters. At the moment, I'm not seeing businesses doing this. What we are seeing is certain businesses looking at the position and assessing what the impact might be. Again, I think it's too early to make knee-jerk reactions in that respect. And then finally, I would encourage everyone to feed into governments, UK government, feed into your own governments about issues that matter to you to ensure that we continue the smooth flow of commerce. I think at the moment there's a lot of noise as people try and understand what Brexit is, but try and focus on those issues that matter to you and get those messages to UK government and your own government. And I think on that I'll hold and pass to the next speaker. Thank you.